Hey y'all, I'm Kim, host of Book Marketing Mania, and I'm so thrilled you're tuning in to learn how to build your audience and reach new readers as a podcast host and guest. If you've ever felt benched by life's circumstances and are now wondering, how the heck do we get back in the game of book marketing and podcasting? Well, that's the question we're answering today with my special guest, my sweet friend and podcasting client, Toni Thrash. Toni is a certified life coach and hosts the Start Your Comeback podcast. And she's celebrating her 1-year podiversary this month. So fun. Congrats, Toni. I was actually on her show as a guest a while back to talk about the transitions and comebacks of a special needs mom. And I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. Toni and I met a few years ago in a Facebook group for writers and realized we live near each other, so we've started getting together on a regular basis, either at a coffee shop or at the library for co-working, and it has helped us both be accountable and consistent with our podcast. So we both know life happens as writers and podcasters. And oh goodness, we both know the dread of getting to the end of your day and realizing, oops, you're supposed to have a podcast out the next day. The struggle is real, and I couldn't wait for you to hear Toni's 3-part framework for dealing with life's transitions that can interrupt our podcasting schedule. You're in for a treat today, so let's get to it. Hey, Toni, welcome to Book Marketing Mania podcast. I'm so thrilled you're here to serve my listeners today.
Hey, Kim, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So this is such a fun treat that Toni and I are getting to record this in person together. And I couldn't wait for her to come on and talk about her journey into podcasting as she writes her first book. So Toni's podcast is Start Your Comeback Show, as y'all heard me talk about in the introduction. So Toni, I want you to share with everybody kind of your journey into podcasting, starting with probably the first summer we met. I think you met with a traditional publisher and we're going to pitch your book idea to them, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I met with an agent at the She Speaks conference, and her biggest takeaway from me was, you need to build your audience bigger than it was. And I was shocked to understand that, but that's what she said to do. And so I came away from that a little bit disgruntled and not sure what to do next.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the same way a lot of our listeners feel, right? Sometimes it is a huge shock when a publisher or agent tells you that, and you weren't thinking about that because you've been working really hard on writing and getting out there in front of your target readers and things. So for a long time, I know we had talked about podcasting because when Toni and I first met, I was actually launching my show. And so that was super exciting to have her kind of come along for that ride. And I immediately started sharing with her how fun it would be for her to launch her own podcast as she builds her platform and starts serving her future readers with content, and especially as a life coach, serving up her future clients with content. So, Toni, let's turn back the page because I know you started your podcast. It was last October, but again, we had met a couple of years prior to that and been talking podcasting. So, Toni, share with our listeners maybe some of the frustrations or hesitations you had around starting a show, because I imagine a lot of our listeners feel the same way.
Yeah, Kim, it's an overwhelming thought. Honestly, you were plugging podcasting from the moment I've met you, and you've never relinquished that. You've just been on and on and on about it. And I guess it was last summer about this time you and I were talking, and I hadn't really been writing anymore. And you were like, you really need to do a podcast, and I can help you do that. And so we just sort of mapped it out. And what you made me realize or helped me to see was that this was an opportunity to create content that could go into my book in the future. And it was a little bit easier for me to do that because, as you can see, I don't mind talking about it too much. And so, we worked on it, probably July, August, September, with the intent of getting it, my birthday's in October, so getting it live during my birthday month.
And that helps so much for us to, once you decided you were going to bite the bullet and do a podcast, it really helped for us to set a deadline and just know that, yeah, you wanted to release it in your birthday month. And that really gave us a specific date to shoot for. And this is definitely why I wanted to have Toni on, is just to talk about, that is such a huge piece of marketing, is getting your content out there and just starting to serve your future readers today with content. And I know, Toni, you used to blog, but I know for me, like when I was starting a podcast, it just seems so much easier, right? Just to podcast, not have to sit down and write a blog post. And I think you're the same way, right? Because you are a verbal communicator and a great speaker and everything. But have you found, like, with podcasting over blogging, there's this, I know it's a self-imposed deadline, right, for your podcast to go up, but do you feel like that's easier? Like, I have I'm going to schedule my podcast to go out every single Thursday and I'm not going to miss it, versus when we were blogging, it's just kind of this haphazard, you don't really have a deadline on it.
I find it so much easier to podcast than to actually write the blog. And I don't understand the science behind all of it. I'm sure there's studies done on why it's easier, but I feel like that getting it out there with my voice, which, I don't necessarily like listening to my voice, but the fear and the overwhelmness of that, once you at least get even the trailer out there, then you're like, okay, I can do this. And then once you get into a rhythm, then it's so much easier than to sit down and go, oh, I got to write 500 words today. Oh, I got to write 1,000 words today. You just sit down and you just talk it out, and it works wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And I want to ask you, Toni, too, because also similar to a lot of our listeners, you have a full-time job. You're a full-time educator. Praise God for you and all the educators out there. But I know, as a busy full-time educator, and even when you started your podcast, you were also doing part-time sports coaching at school. And then, of course, you're a life coach and now a podcaster. And you're also a first-time grandma and just, super busy life. So for similar listeners that are like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to podcast, I don't have time to put one more thing on my plate, what advice would you share with them if they are thinking, oh, I really want to start a podcast, but I just don't think I'm going to have the time for it?
One of the things that you helped me to see is that my podcast doesn't have to be like anybody else's. I can do it however I want, which means I can do it for 10 minutes or 45 minutes. And so that was initially the key for me. And it took me a minute to get into that rhythm, and to where now it doesn't take me long to write an episode or do an episode. But the other thing that you encouraged me to do was to repurpose my content. So all of those blogs that I'd already written over the last 10 years, I could just go back and turn that into a podcast episode. And sometimes in one blog, it could be 3 episodes. Mm-hmm. And so you helped me to see that if I already had something written, then it was so much easier to just go ahead and talk about it and to put it out there. And so, life is busy and I do a lot of things, but the recording aspect, it takes me about 30 minutes to do a podcast episode now. And that 30 minutes is a TV show if you're watching TV shows. So it's not that time intensive. It is more at the beginning because you really don't know what you're doing, and it's trial and error. But once you find that rhythm and that groove, then it's pretty much smooth sailing from there, and it's not as difficult as one thinks.
Yeah, I know. That's so true. We can make it as difficult as we want, right? I mean, there's some people that do like really elaborate things with their podcast, but that's not what either one of us are here for. So I'm so glad we fit it into our schedules. So I want to talk, Toni, about your show specifically. So it was so fun to work with you. And I know, like, what we started working together on in the beginning was the book, whenever you were told to build your platform, but you were also wanting to write your book. And we were just thinking through, well, what are the different sections of your book? And we kind of came up with the framework as you talked to me about your coaching that you normally do with clients. That was super fun to just literally at the library where we're at today. We just got a whiteboard and started scribbling down things. And it was so fun to kind of see everything as Toni walked through what she goes through with her clients and what she might want to write in a book. We kind of came up with this 3-part framework and we started working through that. And then as we started thinking about your podcast, it was the exact same thing. It was just like, this is where Toni shines. And again, it's the Start Your Comeback Show. And her tagline is tackle life's transitions with a winning game plan. And I love that so much because you just see it and you're like, okay, that's what Toni is going to do for me on the podcast. It's also what she could do for me as a life coach. So I love that so much. And I want you to talk a little bit about that, Toni. Just give us a little taste of your podcast, because I know a lot of our listeners are going through different life transitions. You've been through some big ones: divorce, empty nester, first time grandma, taking care of elderly parents, a lot of transitions that I'm sure many of you have been facing. I know you work with clients that are going through retirement. You've talked to me about being a special needs mom, and there's so many things. So I want to ask you, Toni, for our listeners to understand a little bit about transition. And again, I just want this to be a little glimpse into your podcast, because I hope people will hop over there and check it out, because it's so, so good. And I love how Toni wraps up so much good stuff in short episodes. So let's talk about your 3-part framework, Toni, that you talk through clients with for transitions. And so when somebody comes to you and they know about a transition, or maybe they don't know about a transition, what are the 3 different things that you talk to them through?
Well, thanks, Kim. I appreciate that. So there are 3 pillars or 3 stages that we go through in any life transition. And the first one is shock. And so you may see the transition coming, like, say, in retirement. And the other one, it may be a complete and total shock. And so when that happens, regardless if you knew about it or not, there's still some shock, because it's reality now, and you have to face it. And in that stage, it's very difficult to think straight or to make any good, solid decisions. The second phase or stage is called the limbo stage. And that's kind of where maybe most of the shock has worn off, but now you don't have any answers. You're just kind of stuck in the middle of trying to find the answers that you need. And so this is where a life coach can help you come in and build that game plan that's unique to you, so that will help you get through this transition that you're facing. And then finally, the third one is the reentry phase. And this is typically where you've already gone through everything, you have a game plan, you're making that work, and you're re-entering a world that really has changed the rules and no one informed you about it. And so navigating that new reentry and your new normal and what that looks like is difficult, but you have that game plan to see you through. And yes, divorce is not a fun thing to go through, and empty nesting. And both of those at the same time were a really rough period in my life, but it's given me such insight on how to help my clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love how God works that way. And I'm so thankful that even though we have to go through all these hard trials, that you have championed it and felt the calling from God to help other women go through it. And then now, hopefully, there'll be a book in the future. And obviously, they're sharing your free content on your podcast and your life coaching. I love the way God's working through all that. And I think about that. I'd love that framework so much. And every time Toni and I talk, I always I'm like, okay, wait, let's look at your framework and try to wrap everything into that. Because I was thinking, even just simple things like what we're talking about today. I was thinking, okay, maybe you too have sat with a publisher and you're in shock when you hear you need to build a bigger platform to get a book deal. And you may be in limbo after that and not know, okay, what the heck do I do, right? And you need somebody to kind of help you craft out that game plan to re-enter the online world and start building your author platform. And I'm thinking even podcasting. Me and Toni are really good about holding each other accountable. But I think sometimes when you start a podcast, it can be a shock, right? How much work it can be, but it doesn't have to be. Or you might take a break from it and then you're kind of in limbo of how to come back, how to re-enter back into that podcasting world. So no, I just love that framework because I think about it all the time with any kind of transition in my day or in my life, just the shock, limbo, re-entry. And if you want to learn more about those, be sure and hop over to Toni's podcast, Start Your Comeback, and I'll be sure and put a link in the show notes. Well, this has been so fun, Toni, and I know we'll have lots of conversations in the future, but I so appreciate you being here to serve my listeners today.
Thanks so much, Kim. I've enjoyed it so much. You rock solid, and you're just a gem. So thank you so much.
Oh, y'all, I hope you were inspired by Toni's journey and that you'll check out her Start Your Comeback podcast and her coaching if you would like to work with her to create your own winning game plan to tackle life's transitions. I'm so grateful for you tuning in today, and I wanted to give a shout out to one of my listeners, Megan. She says, so much value. Kim is your personal mentor and will guide you energetically through the marketing and podcast guesting process. Each episode helps you take inspired action and clarify your next steps. Add this podcast to your playlist ASAP. Oh, thanks, Megan. That was so sweet. And if Book Marketing Mania is bringing you value as a writer, I hope you'll leave a quick review of the show to let others know it's worth their time to listen and learn too. Thanks for tuning in today. And as always, I'll be there for you next episode to help you build your audience and reach new readers one podcast at a time. See you then.